I am not intolerant, say many people, say many softly spoken, highly educated, liberal-minded people. I'm only intolerant of intolerance. And people tend to nod sagely and say, oh yes, wise words, wise words. And yet if you think about this supposedly inarguable statement for longer than 5 seconds, you realize that all it is advocating is the replacement of one kind of intolerance with another.
Who better to take on the woke mob than Mr. Bean himself? Rowan Atkinson, a master of wit and reason, just delivered a brutal takedown of the increasingly intolerant Western society, one that preaches diversity while silencing dissent. With precision and clarity, he exposed the tragic reality. The very foundation of Western civilization, freedom of speech, is being sabotaged by the very people who claim to fight for inclusion.
Starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely. The most precious thing in life, I think, is food in your mouth, and the third most precious is a roof over your head. But a fixture for me in the number 2 slot is free expression, just below the need to sustain life itself. That is because I have enjoyed free expression in this country all my professional life, and fully expect to continue to do so. Personally, I suspect highly unlikely to be arrested for whatever laws exist to contain free expression because of the undoubtedly privileged position that is afforded to those of a high public profile.
Atkinson isn't just some celebrity throwing out opinions. He's a principled defender of free expression, a man who understands that the moment we start policing speech, we strip society of its ability to think, debate, and grow. And as he rightly points out, the modern left isn't fighting for justice. It's fighting for ideological conformity, where only one narrative is allowed and anything else must be crushed.
It is indicative of a culture that has taken hold of the programs of successive governments, that with the reasonable and well-intentioned ambition to contain obnoxious elements in society, has created a society of an extraordinarily authoritarian and controlling nature.
Freedom of speech isn't a privilege, it's the pinnacle of a free society, and if we let the woke destroy it, we might as well wave goodbye to everything that made the West worth defending in the first place.
So my concerns are less for myself and more for those more vulnerable because of their lower profile. Like the man arrested in Oxford for calling a police horse gay, or the teenager arrested for calling the Church of Scientology a cult, or the cafe owner arrested for displaying passages from the Bible on a TV screen. When I heard of some of these more ludicrous offences and charges, I remembered that I had been here before in a fictional context. I once did a show called Not the 9 O'Clock News some years ago, and we did a sketch where Griff Rhys-Jones played Constable Savage, a manifestly racist police officer to whom I, as his station commander, is giving a dressing down for arresting a black man on a whole string of ridiculous, trumped up and ludicrous charges. The charges for which Constable Savage arrested Mr. Winston Kadogo of 55 Mercer Road were these: walking on the cracks in the pavement, walking in a loud shirt in a built-up area during the hours of darkness, and one of my favourites, walking around all over the place. He was also arrested for urinating in a public convenience and looking at me in a funny way. Who would have thought that we would end up with a law that would allow life to imitate art so exactly?
Rowan Atkinson, in his usual sharp-witted fashion, just laid bare a terrifying truth. Freedom of speech is increasingly becoming a privilege rather than a right. And who does this new twisted system favor? The powerful, the elite, people like him protected by status, wealth, and influence. But what about the average person who dares to speak his mind? If the everyday citizen is afraid to speak, then free speech doesn't exist at all. A society where only the privileged can speak freely is not a free society, it's an authoritarian joke. Because the right to speak your mind is not a privilege handed down by the state, but a fundamental right. And if we let this right erode, we won't just be silencing voices, we'll be dismantling the civilization itself.
I read somewhere a defender of the status quo claiming that the fact that the gay horse case was dropped after the arrested man refused to pay the fine, and that the Scientology case was also dropped at some point during the court process, was proof that the law was working well, ignoring the fact that the only reason these cases were dropped was because of the publicity that they had attracted. The police sensed that ridicule was just around the corner and withdrew their actions. But what about the thousands of other cases that did not enjoy the oxygen of publicity, that weren't quite ludicrous enough to attract media attention? Even for those actions that were withdrawn, people were arrested, questioned, taken to court, and then released. You know, that isn't a law working properly. That is censoriousness of the most intimidating kind, guaranteed to have, as Lord Dear says, a chilling effect on free expression and free protest.
Rowan Atkinson beautifully summed it up with censoriousness of the most intimidating kind, because that is what it is. He just hit on one of the most sinister aspects of modern censorship. It's selective enforcement. The only reason some people escape the jaws of this authoritarian madness is because their cases go viral. Public scrutiny forces the authorities to back off, not because they suddenly respect free speech, but because they fear the backlash. But what about the thousands of others? The ones whose arrests never make the headlines? The ones who don't have celebrities or public outrage shielding them? That's the true danger here, a system where free speech is no longer a right, but a gamble. If you're lucky enough to catch public attention, maybe you'll walk free. But if not, you're dragged through the courts, humiliated and financially ruined, all for daring to say something someone deemed offensive. This mob doesn't need to outright ban free speech. They just have to make the consequences so terrifying that people self-censor out of sheer survival instinct. That's not freedom. That's tyranny in disguise. And if we don't wake up to it now, we might not get another chance.
We do not think that language or behavior that is merely insulting should ever be criminalized in this way. The clear problem with the outlawing of insult is that too many things can be interpreted as such. Criticism is easily construed as insult by certain parties. Ridicule easily construed as insult. Sarcasm, unfavorable comparison, merely stating an alternative point of view to the orthodoxy can be interpreted as insult. And because so many things can be interpreted as insult, it is hardly surprising that so many things have been, as the examples I talked about earlier show.
Atkinson is right. Outlawing insult doesn't just stifle speech, it dismantles the very foundation of open debate. If we can't ridicule, criticize, or even disagree without fear of legal punishment, then free speech is nothing more than a decorative relic, a hollow promise with no real substance. This is exactly why free societies must resist these authoritarian speech codes. The moment you allow subjective feelings to dictate legality, you've handed the most thin-skinned, intolerant, and hysterical individuals the power to police what can and cannot be said. And who are the biggest enforcers of this? The very people who claim to fight for tolerance, yet demand absolute submission to their worldview.
That is what you might call the new intolerance, a new but intense desire to gag uncomfortable voices of dissent. I am not intolerant, say many people, say many softly spoken, highly educated, liberal-minded people. I'm only intolerant of intolerance. And people tend to nod sagely and say, oh yes, wise words, wise words. And yet if you think about this supposedly inarguable statement for longer than 5 seconds, you realize that all it is advocating is the replacement of one kind of intolerance with another, which to me doesn't represent any kind of progress at all.
A free society doesn't criminalize offense. It accepts that being offended is part of life. And if you can't handle that, maybe the problem isn't society, it's you.
For me, the best way to increase society's resistance to insulting or offensive speech is to allow a lot more of it. As with childhood diseases, you can better resist those germs to which you have been exposed. We need to build our immunity to taking offense so that we can deal with the issues that perfectly justified criticism can raise. Laudable efforts to restrict speech can become a tool to silence critics or oppress minorities. The strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, it is more speech.
Rowan Atkinson with such views doesn't feel like an artist here, but a scholar, a statesman of the highest caliber, and he's spot on here. Thick skin isn't developed through censorship, it's developed through exposure. If you want a strong, rational, and free-thinking society, you don't criminalize offense, you normalize the ability to handle it. This is why free speech is not just a right, but a necessity for a functioning society. You must be exposed to discomfort, to disagreement, to the occasional offensive remark, because that is how you develop resilience. The alternative, a culture of fragile, hypersensitive people who see words as weapons and demand protection from reality itself. Reality